Hello, everybody, and welcome to Strip Search, the comic strip podcast. We are here in May of 2024. I am Pete Chienka. I am here, as always, with Dave London. Hiya, Dave.
Hey, Pete.
Welcome, welcome. And we were just discussing a little bit before we went on the air. You got some important mail today. It wasn't a summons or anything, was it?
No, I'm not going to jail. Everybody, we're all good. Actually, I got um, I'm a member of the National Cartoonist Society, which is the organization of professional cartoonists, not just in the U.S. but overseas, and frankly, the entire known universe. Really, is I think it all encompasses it. But the Rubin Awards are coming up, which is the sort of cartooning version of the Oscars. And so I got as a relatively new member of the NCS. I've got the ballot to vote, and so you can see this is what the ballot looks like. And so it's kind of a fun little opportunity to be able to vote for
And
cartoonist
it
of the year.
and it's been narrowed down now to nominees like the Oscars, right? You're not just picking them out of thin air.
So sort of. So there's subject categories that are narrowed down to nominees, but the sort of overarching one you just pick. So they actually let you. So they don't actually. You just sort of list who you think should be the cartoonist of the year based on somebody in your view whose work and what they've done for the past year merits winning the award. So the big one is actually kind of open. You can put anybody down. I can put you down, really.
And I could put you down where I to
Right.
vote. I am not a member of the National Cartoonist Society, so I can't. But you could nominate yourself, I assume.
I suppose you could. That'd be like pardoning yourself if you were president or something like that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that would never happen. The Supreme
Right.
Court would never allow it. Uh,
So,
well, so you're going to give this, I assume you're going to give this some serious thought before
I
you
am.
head
I
to
am.
paper.
I'm going to do some serious thought. I'm going to do a lot of due diligence, and I'm going to get out the dartboard and no.
You accept checks, credit
Right.
cards. I
Right.
mean, we know,
Exactly.
a lot of cartoonists from this show, and you just through your personal travels. So it's hard, probably not, to take the personalities out of it.
It is. It is. You gotta, and it's not just sort of a fan favorite. It's not like the Lifetime Achievement Award. It's really somebody who in the last year the contribution to the cartooning world merits it. So, it's not just sort of pick your favorite cartoonist kind of thing.
Bill Watterson.
For example, right, right. If he comes on the show, I will pick him then.
Yes, I don't care if he didn't draw anything.
Right.
Bill, if
Just
you're listening, come on the
although
show. You get our vote.
he actually did. He drew for that book. He came out with a novel, right? With a
That's
co-op.
true. I don't know if you consider that a cartooning
Yeah.
project so much as illustration, but he
Um,
emerged from hibernation at the very least. So
him and JD Salinger, right? I think.
right, right. I think they're living together out there somewhere
Right,
in
right,
the wilderness.
right. Um, and I guess the other thing we want to just plug before we get to our extra special guest, June 8th, we've got the Boston Kids Comic Fest, another great event that's held locally here in Boston. And we will also put some information on our website about that. Pete, you and I will be there with Pet Peeves. And that I don't have the list of attendees in front of me. If I was more prepared, I probably could have done that. But
People could,
um,
Google Boston Kids Comic Fest. It always has a terrific lineup. Jonathan Todd, who we had on here a little while back, whose new middle-age graphic novel "Timid" is breaking records left and right. Is an organizer and founder of that, and will be there. And really too many to go into, but that's a big one, and it's right in Boston at Northeastern University, right? Is that where it is these days?
I will check on that.
Yes, I believe it is.
Yes, last year it was. I haven't looked at the location off the top of my head,
Yeah, I
but
believe it's the same place. So it's right downtown. Just watch out for the encampments.
right.
Uh, do what you can to
Don't,
avoid.
don't trip over the tents or the police presence.
It's
So,
right, right. Leave your. Yeah,
politics at home.
I'm not gonna get into it. I
Right.
was gonna
Yes.
make some recommendations about what to wear and not what not to wear,
Right.
but we won't do
Right.
that. And the other thing, before we get to our very special guest, who happens to be Mr. Bob Eckstein, who's been on the show a couple of times and is one of our favorite cartoonists and illustrators. Speaking of books, because I think we did at one point in the last 10 minutes,
Sure.
our new book Nerd Dad, a pet peeves collection, is very close to being done. If all goes according to plan, we will have it ready before Father's Day.
It's
Is
it's
that overly
we
ambitious?
we just have to write it and draw it, and it'll be all set. So
Right.
just two things left.
Right. Two
But no,
steps.
we should have it ready for Father's Day. A great Father's Day gift. Really, the best Father's Day gift you can get
I
somebody
can't
is the new
even
pet
think of
peeves
I can't even think. It's better than a Craftsmaster drill.
or socks.
Right.
Really, just either way.
Or a tie.
Or
All right. All right. Well, we're not going to keep you waiting any longer. We're going to take a very brief break and we will be back with Bob Eckstein. Stay tuned, everybody. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strip Search, the comic strip podcast with me, your host, Pete Chianca, along with your other host, Dave London. And as always, we are at our favorite part of the show. No one likes to hear us talking to each other. We like to talk to somebody else. And in this case, we're talking to a very special guest who's been nice enough to come on today. Our guest today is an illustrator, writer, and cartoonist for The New Yorker, New York Times, Reader's Digest, Smithsonian Magazine, and many others. His book, Footnotes from the World's Greatest Bookstores, was a New York Times bestseller. He is also the world's leading snowman expert, having written and illustrated several books on that subject, along with one about cats. He lives in New York City, but we won't hold that against him. Welcome, Bob Eckstein, to Strip Search.
Great to be here, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming back on. And I didn't mention probably the most important thing. You have a very exciting new project that we're going to see within days of this recording. Um, and the funny thing is, well, just to preface it, I understand that when you were a kid, you had a similar opinion of museums as I did, in that you hated getting dragged to them by your parents. But now you are the author of Footnotes from the Most Fascinating Museums. So what happened?
Yeah, it took some time to come around to them. I think every kid's the same way. We all get dragged on to these museums that we wouldn't pick ourselves. We get they bring us to they being our parents. We go to Washington D.C. and we read some plaques, but there's so many museums out there. In this country, there's like over 7,000 museums on like every subject. So there's something for everyone out there. And now that we can go and pick our own places, I mean, I love museums.
So with the new book that's coming out, so you're known probably best as a cartoonist, but in this book, you've actually used your painting skills and your illustrating skills, which probably is apropos given that it's about museums. Although there are cartoonist museums out there as well. How did you approach your artwork for the subject matter? What went into the thought process, the materials you used, and really just let us know. Did you go to every museum that you painted, or did you have to, use Google Image for some of them?
Well, there was a mix. It was impossible logistically to go to every museum because initially the list was about 170 museums. So to collect all the stories and to paint all those museums, it's logistically impossible. So I had some help, but I had been to most of the museums. I had been to them before I started the project. And once I started the project, I did go out to the West Coast. I went to the Midwest, Chicago, and all the major cities. And I try to go as many places as I can go to. And I would take photographs and I would sketch. Now, to answer your question about my choice of medium, I was always a painter. Even when I was a kid, I was doing paintings. I didn't start cartoons until late. I didn't start cartoons until 2007 when I was at this restaurant with Sam Gross and some other people. And we were just enjoying lunch. And I was having a very nice time with these fellows. And I asked if I could come back to this restaurant. It was their weekly meeting that the New Yorker cartoonists would have. And I happened to be invited because it was my birthday. So they said, well, you can come back, Sam Gross said. He said, but you got to come back with cartoons next time because you're going to have to submit. And I did some cartoons, and the New Yorker did buy the first cartoon that I did. And they ran the first cartoon I tried, and that was in 2007. decades after I had been already illustrating, and I had been illustrating as a teenager for different publications and writing humor for different magazines and newspapers. I started at New York Newsday and the Village Voice when I was very young, and I had a column. And so I was illustrating way back then, and I've always wanted to do painting and stuff. For this particular project, what I did was based on what the museum called for. I simply was the background music to the beautiful museums, and I just kind of try to lend my skills to what was needed. But I was very much a secondary person in this whole process in the sense that the museum itself told me what style I should try to do. Now, the work is done digitally, and that's because not because I can't paint with oil paint and traditional materials, but only because it was logistically impossible to do 150 canvases, very large, scan them, and then change it for the different languages of the book. My bookstore book, for instance, is in many different languages. So I couldn't really just have one thing set. I had to be flexible. I had to make things in layers. And so that was the reason for that. And really, it's the same for me because it really is just painting the same way. I do oil painting now, and it looks about the same. It's very similar process. There's a lot less cleanup, and
Yeah.
there's a lot less supplies to put away, but it's really more in line with each other than one would imagine. And if you see the work, and if you see my traditional work, you'll see there's very little difference. It's basically the same hand.
And for those of us who like to geek out on the actual program, what was your program of choice?
Well, I use Corel Painter, an old version of it, and that's what I like best. I don't use Photoshop or Procreate or any of those other programs. I've never used those. But I did use a tablet, a Welcome tablet, one in which doesn't directly draw it immediately on the screen, but has got that second generation where you draw it on the pad and then it shows up. And this is really a natural thing for me because I've been doing a lot of live drawing at events where I need to draw on an iPad. So I'm very familiar with just drawing with the electronics. I actually like doing it anyway, either way you give me. I started working with just a stick and an inkwell. When I was in college, my professor wanted me to strip away all the stuff that I was learning. He felt that I was overworking everything. And I would do this, I would do these paintings in French crayons and using materials like, trying to think of the names of it, gel medium. I have to go back a ways. This is, this is going back to when I was in school. There was no history class. It was current events. So I would use crayons and I would use these materials to make it look like oil paint. And I love working that way. But at some point, the professor said, I want you to strip down everything to the basics. So you're just working with something that's like just your feeling. And he made me draw with just sticks dipping into inkwells. And for a year, that's all I did. Now, when it comes to the work I'm doing for the book, the line work is really irrelevant. Really, what's the whole point of the work now in the book is decision making. Decision making with lights and shadows. Everything, as you've seen with the book, has to do with um, luminosity and just feeling like a sense of space and color. And I'm really not concerned too much with the line work, even though there is line work there that's accurate. And I tried to be, try to illustrate exactly what I saw. I'm more concerned with the feeling of the light.
I mean, you certainly, as from a layman's perspective, I feel like you really are capturing the feel of a lot of these places, the ones I've been to and the ones I haven't. I imagine that this is what it feels like, in a way to be there. And sort of as the word guy in our duo here, I really like the accompanying stories that went with them. They're not by any means boilerplate information about what you could find at these museums. They really are stories, and you
Oh, thank
collected
you.
them from various sources, right?
What I did was I tried every which way to get a story. And that meant sometimes secretly from workers, anonymously. It meant sometimes going to visitors who had been there, who are fans of the museum. And I also went to the heads of the museums and sat down with the curators and told them about my project. But often what would happen is either I'd get someone who totally got me and would share with me a gem of a story, like the one I got for the Philadelphia Museum, in which somebody on the staff got fired for having sex on the artwork right before the museum opened. And it's
Is
there's
that
more.
wrong?
It
Because if
is
someone
according
had
to
told me,
it is wrong according to the employee handbook. The employee handbook says you're not allowed to touch any of the artwork. And the person who in charge of HR said to the person that she fired, that means you certainly can't have sex on the artwork. But
fair enough.
but what I did was, and there were other times in which the curator would give me a story that was like a PR statement, and it was glossy, and it was very much like you would see in a brochure. And what I was trying to do is show a part of the museum or a side of the museum that you would normally see. The drawings themselves are idealistic and sexy versions of the museum. The museum doesn't look necessarily like that, but it's an interpretation of the essence of it and makes it very glamorous. And the stories too are trying to go a little deeper than you would see on their website. It's something like, oh my God, this story is amazing. It's a secret. Another story would be at the Met. A friend of mine tried to not steal artwork, but to break in and put his artwork on the wall so he could say he was on the Met. So stories like that was what I was looking for. And the way to get the best stories for the book was that I had collected way more than I used. And I only used like a third of the stories that I had collected. So these are just like the best vetted stories that I knew would tantalize and inspire people to go visit the museum and make the museum have another dimension that you wouldn't normally think of.
So, we know that you're a native New Yorker, and we also know you spent some time in your early part of um, schooling in Boston, but New York is obviously well represented in the book. We're from Massachusetts here, so we need to make the plug and ask you about the Massachusetts museums. Which of the Massachusetts museums in your book do you have a particular favorite or favorites?
Well, Massachusetts has best museums. It's as simple as that. They have the most in the country. They have over 800 museums in Massachusetts alone. And my favorite artists are featured in those museums. Um, there's the MoCA, all the way on the western corner of Massachusetts, which has, um, well, some of the best fine artists, the contemporary artists there, like Kiefer, who is the German artist who has his own exhibit hall at that location, which is absolutely amazing. And if you get a chance to see the documentary about him, you'll get a sense of that. It's the name of the movie is Ansem, Anselm. I think that's how you pronounce it. And he's just amazing. But then now back to Boston, of course, there's these amazing museums like the Fine Arts Museum of Boston and the Isabella Gardner Museum, which has some of the most amazing stories, including the largest heist ever in the history of art.
Mm-hmm.
And you go there and you learn that the place has not replaced these stolen paintings because in the will, it was not allowed to change anything in the house. Everything had to be left alone. So you see exactly where these paintings are missing. But of course, it's a beautiful garden and location and just a really special place. And then going back to the Fine Arts Museum, well, oh, that's just amazing too. I don't even know where to begin.
Mm.
The stories I have for that are just wonderful too. One of the stories is how Vincent van Gogh had a painting, which they discovered very recently, had another painting hidden below it. And through the new technology of X-rays, they found this missing painting. And the story in my book explains why that is. But my favorite museum in the Boston area, hands down, is the Peabody Essence Museum. For different
very
reasons.
close. That's up my way on the North Shore. I was happy to see that that made the cut.
Well, not only did it make the cut, I made sure it got its due by giving it 3 pages. And I didn't know where to begin. There's so many stories to share. But I illustrated one of the real features of that museum is they relocated a Chinese village house piece by piece inside the museum for you to see. And seeing how they lived in this time of, I think, 16th century, it's just amazing. You could see how much of a different world it is. You're actually there in the kitchen and the living rooms from this old village. But that's just one little part of the museum. The museum is just spectacular, and it touches on a subject that I love, which is marine time stuff. I had spent some time in San Diego, where the Star of India is the oldest ship in the world. The oldest working ship is located at that marina. And that's the ship that starred in Master and Commander, one of my favorite movies. And going to that museum and spending time on that ship for days inspired me to write my next novel that takes place on a ship in the 1850s. And every museum was inspiring for some reason or another. It was very moving.
Well, I have to ask about another Boston museum that people might be less familiar with, which is the Museum of Bad Art, which is an actual place.
Yeah, that museum is really something else. I mean, that's another one that touches a nerve with me, because in my own home that I'm filming right now, we have a collection of bad art. We try to find the worst art ever. And I mean, that's what I mean, though. There's a museum for everyone, even people who are anti-art. Here it is, the Museum of Bad Art. And I plan to go back there sometime soon. I want to go back to all these museums, but especially the Boston museums is close enough to New York City for me to drive to. And there's such a concentration of great places that I really want to make a loop and go back to a few of them.
So another museum, it's not Boston, it's Massachusetts though, but the Norman Rockwell Museum is a very famous museum, I think. What can you talk about the Norman Rockwell and your thoughts?
You know what? Norman Rockwell has a special spot for me in my heart. I mean, I appreciate what he did, but I was never that much a Norman Rockwell guy as an illustrator growing up, that I had him as an influence. Not really at all. I appreciate it, and they appreciate me. I've spoken there twice, and I'll probably be doing another event there. So I'm a real big part of that museum myself. And it's a beautiful museum, but at the same time, it's a style of art that's right now my mindset is not in. Right now, my mindset is in abstract art, contemporary art, things that are just unusual, especially if someone who's studied illustration for so many years. I'm looking for something a little more different. An example of that was the Jurassic Technology Museum in Los Angeles, where you go in and everything there is just so unusual and so new. And then at some point, I realized that the museum wasn't real, that the museum itself was a piece of artwork. It was really an installation of what a museum could be. And to me, this touches on my comedy geek side. Now, I like comedy. I write comedy. I used to write for Mad and National Lampoon and Spy, and I still write humor for a living. So to me, I love humor. And I love Andy Kaufman. And this is the Andy Kaufman of museums. This is someone pushing the envelope and surprising me totally.
And something else I want to ask you about, just by way of background, I'm from Hartford originally. I've been in Massachusetts for about 30 years, but I grew up in Hartford. And so the Mark Twain house is one of my all-time favorites just from growing up right near there. So I wanted to ask you, and that's not a museum about art, but you have a whole section in your book on historic homes. So I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on the Mark Twain house.
Yeah, the Mark Twain house is really amazing too. And I will be speaking there, I believe, in June. And that's because we have such a nice relationship. I totally appreciate how much Mark Twain meant. And I think that a lot of these places you don't realize and you take for granted the importance of the art form or the person or whatever the museum is focused on. And with Mark Twain, when I went to the museum, I had a whole different impression of him after I left, because then you could see how much he influenced everything. In the same way, I just came from the Irma Bombeck
Mm.
conference, and there's the Irma Bombeck Museum, and I spoke there. And only when you get yourself entrenched in that world do you realize how much a difference she made to everyone. So the Mark Twain thing, not only is he important, but that is a world-class museum. The museum is absolutely amazing, and you get a chance to tour a home that is so fascinating. And even if Mark Twain wasn't the person who resided in that place, you'd go just to see the home. Now, the Elmer Bombeck Museum is not in the book, and I couldn't include every museum. There's just no way, because one of the top priorities of my book was to keep it affordable. It bothers me that books have gotten expensive and certain people don't want to buy a book. I mean, I know that regular books can go for $35, $37. So I didn't want any part of that. I wanted to make my book very affordable, but I had to make compromises. And that meant cutting half the museums. And right now I just focus on 75 museums, which is a tremendous amount anyway. And I don't want ever to have a feeling of fatigue for my readers that they don't want to, finish the book. But the Irma Bombeck Museum, for instance, didn't make the cut, because as interesting as she was, it's the Mark Twain Museum that takes it to another level, and that's a world-class museum. So that's one of the criterias of why certain museums are in the book. There's different reasons why a person would enjoy the institution, and not just importance, historical significance, but it also had to do with family entertainment. How much, would you want to go back? And also even how much they're involved in the community. A lot of these museums give back and have really helped their locations.
I mean, I would
And
hope seeing something like this would maybe inspire people to go visit the museums close to them. I think if you talk to the average, I mean, there are people who are avid museum goers, but I think the average person has probably visited more museums in faraway cities they visited than the ones in their backyard, so to speak. I know
Yes.
when I go, like you say, you'll go to Washington, D.C. It's part of a trip. You'll go to spend the day in New York City from Boston or somewhere else. And you never get into Boston to see
Yeah.
the 800 museums we have there. So I feel like that's something that, somebody reading this book might be inspired to do.
Oh, that's a great point. I also see the book as being a sort of must read for summer for your vacation plans, because we all have to sort of shift to what we're going to do for our vacations. And I haven't had a vacation in many years, although I went to these museums. So that was my vacation. But I do want people to feel like there's other ways out there, because a lot of people are strapped budget wise, and airfare has gotten very expensive. So, like you said, there is a vacation closer by than you think. We've taken for granted maybe some of these beautiful places we can go, or within driving range, which is to me like 2 or 3 hours is still possible to take a family. I'm actually going to be planning a trip to go to a museum I haven't been to yet, and that's the National Comedy Center, and that's in Lucille Ball's hometown of Jamestown, New York,
Hmm.
which is actually more than 6 hours away from every place. There's no place close to it at all for
Isn't it
any.
amazing how many places in New York are nowhere near anything?
Exactly. New York
It's a
is
very
very,
big
very big.
state.
Exactly. There is another place that's like near nothing, and that's Storm King. And that's also in my book as well, which, and I've been to that, but that is near nowhere. That is upstate New York, and you have to take a good ride. And, first you tell the people in your car that you're going apple picking, or you deceive them. You have to trick them into the car. And then they find you go to Storm King. But once you get out of the car and you see these amazing sculptures sort of built into the ground, it's mind blowing. I mean, a lot of these places were like that until you went to the place, you didn't realize what you were in for. And then once you're there, it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
And also, when we were kids and didn't really love museums, museums didn't have the technology. Like now you go to the humor museum, the first thing you do is you get tested for your sense of humor. And then you get a wristband that's a special band that you walk around with the rest of the day. And wherever you go in each room, it registers what your sense of humor is, and it gears the humor to what your test results were. And this way you're not actually going in with your grandma and all of a sudden you're watching, let's say, Andrew Dice Clay and doing something that's that's going to make the whole day regrettable.
So whenever Dave walks into a room, it's the campfire scene from Blazing Saddles.
Could be. I think so, right?
Okay, just checking. And that's a perfect segue into another museum in your book, and you're getting a sense of my level of intellect here. But the Spam Museum in Columbus, Ohio, did make the cut, right? That's in there.
That's in there too. They have a sweet story about supplying the food for a wedding when an older man proposed to his girlfriend in the museum. They were both in their 80s. But that museum to me just makes the cut barely. I put it in there because it's it's a little bit of a novelty, but I
Yep.
really didn't want to commercialize the things. Spam Museum kind of falls into the category of so many museums where, like, Wonder Bread has a museum, and
Yeah.
Hasbro has a museum, and Hershey and stuff like that. And sometimes you go into those places and you do feel like you're in a commercial. So I am promoting here people being a little bit more aware of art and maybe broadening their horizons. And because the museums that I just mentioned, a lot of those museums, most families are already aware of.
Right.
So I wanted to point out museums that maybe it's right there and they didn't realize how much fun they could have. They just thought of it as a stuffy museum that you don't bring kids. But museums have changed. Well, it's all high tech. You go now to the Museum of Natural History in New York City. You're walking into a big cage of live butterflies, and you have different exhibits that you would never imagine they could pull off that are geared for children.
I need to go, and I haven't been there since I was a child. So I need to get back. And now my
Oh,
children
it's
aren't
special.
children anymore.
So you went there. Let me ask you this. What is your favorite diorama? Because in me, it's burned in my memory, like my favorite scene in which they recreate behind glass.
That's a good question. I do remember the like the Native Americans, right? And the Eskimos, was that there?
You're going to have to cut this out, This is the
Right, you don't,
whole issue right now of, the terminology, of course.
right,
I'm
right.
saying it because we could geek out here now. I was scolded for including an igloo in a cartoon. Never mind the fact that using the word Eskimo
Right.
is totally off the table, and so there has been a lot of that with museums. They want to be careful that they're representing the different groups correctly. And I've been writing about this on the side in magazine articles about, making sure that these groups are represented the way they wish.
A little bit of a segue there. You talk about, the cartooning aspect of your career, and so
Yes.
without maybe necessarily leaving fully the museum book, I just thought, given that you opened the door there, we talk a little bit about your cartoons, and you're a collector of cartoons, and you've been involved in the books of collections of cartoons. Is there anything, like your Ultimate Cartoon books, anything on the cartoon front we should expect from you soon?
Well, I continue to do cartoons, but the landscape has changed so much. Um, I mean, it's great that everyone's doing cartoons, but at the same time, there is a glut right now of cartoons or people doing cartoons. What I fear is that a lot of the people who do it for a living will have been squeezed out because it's now recreational.
Hmm.
The cartoon world thing it is very much an open mic, and it's the same problem with other things. Like stand-up comedians are feeling that crunch where everyone's doing stand-up, and there's just not enough to support to make a living more than, let's say, 400 stand-up comedians. I was talking to some stand-up comedians. I don't know how they come up with this number, but they they were saying that that's about how many they could afford to fit into the field before it becomes something where they can't get enough income because it's spread too thinly. The pie is sliced too thin. And with cartooning, as I still do cartooning, I'm lucky enough to have these other avenues. And I do speaking and I do teaching and I do all these other things. So I'm lucky enough that I could pivot and I'm not totally reliant on cartoons as I once was. There was a period in which for years I was just doing cartoons. But right now, I don't know how easy that would be for anyone. And I really feel bad for the comic strips, what's going on with the newspapers and the lack of support.
Hmm.
And I wish there was a solution. I don't know what the solution is. I know with
We wish there was a solution too.
yeah, I know, and
Us having a sort of.
everyone likes to say, well, it's simple. You could do newsletters or you could do online and stuff, but it's very hard to stand out and brand without the power of a newsletter or a newspaper. There are
Hmm.
newsletters that are like newspapers. That's why I made that mistake because I consider some newsletters as big as newspapers, which have an audience of about 1 million. But they're far and few between. And you really need the cloud of a newspaper behind the comic strip to really get that traction. And no, it's very frustrating. I just wrote an op-ed about this, which appears in some newspapers, and it's going to continue to appear in newspapers about the importance of newspapers. And I contend that it's important in general with this division in our country. This country now is politically divided, and newspapers is part of the reason why there's a problem because people don't rely anymore on newspapers as much as their news source. And there's a
Hmm.
lack of community, the lack of bringing people together through a newspaper. Instead, what we do is we select one of 3 or 4 major news outlets for our news source. And those are coming to us slanted, and they have a very specific angle and agenda where a local newspaper shouldn't have and wouldn't have. And that's one of the reasons I think this country is feeling very separate.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. As somebody who works for a company that still is publishing a local newspaper, and or at least a regional one that pays my salary, but I think they do a good job of it, and it's nice they still have an audience. But so many of them, are just not there anymore, and I think it's made a difference. Um, and in terms of, David mentioned you're sort of also, in addition to being a cartoonist, a collector of cartoons. And just to give, for people who haven't seen the any of the editions of the Ultimate Cartoons collections, I love them because they have a really nice feel to them. It's like you feel like it's elevating these panels, and preserving them in a way. And they're on particular subjects, and they're really some of the best cartoonists out there. So would you consider doing another one of those down the road, if you find a topic you're interested in compiling?
That was a thank you to the people who changed my career and inspired me. So I picked my favorite cartoonists and people who are often the case friends, and it was an homage to them. I don't think I could do it again. For starters, many of my close friends have passed away,
Mm,
and my favorite cartoonists are no longer with us. Um, from Jack Ziegler, um, there's just I'm going to start naming people. That's going to be very sad. I'm
mm.
going to George Booth's memorial in a couple of days, and the list goes on to how many people who have we've lost were great. And I am glad that I had the chance to have them in my books, as well as interview them in my own podcast, which was all about cartoons and stuff. And these books are beautiful, and they are a high level. You know, these are the best of the best. The people included Raj Chaz and Danny Shanahan, who's no longer with us. Bob Mankoff was in the book. Um, Michael Crawford was in the book, who's no longer with us. Ed Koren, who is no longer with us. These are all the best cartoonists. Um, I don't know how to say this nicely, but I couldn't get that level of work now.
That's a good point.
And unless I'm doing it the way I think it should be done, it has to be done on merit. It has to be done quality. I am not willing to say it's just for the sake of, we're doing another sequel. I have to make sure it's at the least the level of the other books.
Right. Right. Well, for anyone out there who doesn't have one, or there's three of them, right? Total.
There's three of them. They each have a theme. So then one of them is about love, divorce, and marriage. And there's one that's called Everyone's a Critic.
Hmm.
And that is really my favorite.
I
Those,
think that's mine too. Yeah.
the cartoons in them are very good. And then there's one on bookstores, but it's basically run its course. It's sold out. There's no more available. If you get a copy, it's hard to find. They're not going to be reprinted. The publisher has folded. It's very sad. And so I've had to kind of like just move on and say it's unfortunate, but it's definitely in my past.
Well, that's good to know. I'll be putting my copies in Mylar bags and
Or sell them
preserving
on
them.
eBay for a fortune.
Right. I'll pass them along to my heirs.
Yeah, I
Uh,
just saw someone just sent me an ad that's saying that my new museum book is at Walmart's, and it was priced on their website at $2,700, $50. So I just want to make it clear that actually you could purchase it at your local bookstore or bookshop.org or other places. It's sold anywhere for just $27.
don't pay 2,700.
That's a $2,600 discount. That's a
Well,
savings. You can't afford to pass up that value.
you actually just segued perfectly into my final question. Believe it or not, we're already out of time. But what else do people need to know about where to find footnotes from the most fascinating museums? It sounds like you mentioned bookshop.org. Can they go to your website, I'm assuming?
You could. I mean, what I'd like to say is any bookstore can get any book. People don't realize when they shop for a book that just because you don't see it physically, all you need to do is ask them to order it and they'll get it to you. And the difference in price from buying it online is really pretty minute. It doesn't make much of a difference money-wise. You're talking about a small amount. Unless you're not living near a store, then I understand that using online is a necessity. But if you can, you could try to support the local bookstores and they will have it. Now, what I've been working on is a newsletter called The Bob. It's a very popular newsletter. Some of the most famous comedians and humorists subscribe. They not only subscribe, but I quote them and use them for interviews. And I use their advice to share with my readers. So if you want to, you can get the Substack, The Bob. And if you want to, anybody who hears this now, tell me that you heard it from here, and I'll give you not just a free subscription, but I'll upgrade you to a paid. What I've been doing is anybody who purchases my museum book, I actually give them a lifetime free paid subscription. And it's a lot of fun. It's cartoons and humor, and that's just The Bob. And you could just look me up. If you want to sign up for The Bob too, you can go to my website, And my website is bobeckstein, one word, .com, and that's ECKSTEIN. And you could just go there and you can enjoy some of the stuff there, and you could subscribe there and send me an email saying that you would like to have a paid subscription, and I'll waive the fee.
Excellent. Well, Bob Eckstein, thank you so much for taking the time today to come on Strip Search. I would highly recommend. I actually am looking forward to holding the museum's book in my hand. I've read the PDF, which is good, but not the same as going into a bookstore and actually, picking it up off the shelf. So thank you again for coming in, and everybody go out and find Footnotes from the Most Fascinating Museums. And check back with us next month when we'll be reporting back on our new book, on our latest appearances, and on the latest in the world of cartooning and illustration, and who knows what else. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.